All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. Next up is the Other Scott Horton. He is the heroic anti-torture human rights lawyer and contributing editor of Harper's magazine. He writes a blog there called No Comment, harpers.org/subjects/no comment. He's a New York attorney known for his work in emerging markets and international law, especially human rights law and the law of armed conflict. He lectures at Columbia Law School. A lifelong human rights advocate, Horton served as counsel to Andrei Sakharov and Elena Bonner, among other activists in the former Soviet Union. He is a co-founder of the American University in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan and has been involved in some of the most significant foreign investment projects in the Central Eurasian region. He recently led a number of studies of abuse issues associated with the conduct of the War on Terror for the New York City Bar Association, where he has chaired several committees, including most recently the Committee on International Law. He's also a member of the board of the National Institute of Military Justice, the Andrei Sakharov Foundation, the Eurasia Group, and the American branch of the International Law Association. Welcome back to the show, Other Scott Horton. How are you doing this morning?
Great. Great to be with you.
And I guess it's only this morning for me. You're over there on the other side of the country where it's the afternoon, so good afternoon.
And that's right, and I'm just back, in fact, last night, because I spent last week in Central Asia.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, start off with that. Tell us what's going on there. Are you making pipeline deals?
Well, actually, they have an election in Kyrgyzstan, and I was there trying to figure out what's happening after the election. It's the first election in Central Asia's history that's been completely free, fair, and open.
Really?
Yeah, and the result is that the governing parties actually didn't win. In fact, nobody won. The vote was highly fragmented, and now we've got 5 parties that went past the post, representing a spectrum of different views, and they're trying to figure out how to make a coalition government.
But so it looks like the people who are the ruling party now are going to abide by this election and not just call out the police forces into the streets?
Yeah, they did a good job. In fact, they issued orders that, the government was not supposed to lobby for anybody, and that every party had its own representatives at the polls and everything else. So I think there's broad agreement that the elections were, generally fair. There weren't, not to say that there weren't incidents and problems that occurred in different places, but most people agree that, this highly fragmented result in which no party got more than 17%, pretty much reflects the way people voted. And now we got to see if the spirit of consensus building can take hold so they can actually form a government. That's not going to be too easy for them, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the last time we talked about Central Asia, or about Kyrgyzstan particularly, there had been, ethnic, I guess almost like full-scale pogrom-level violence between different clans and factions and people in power refusing to back down, and all kinds of madness going on. So is that over, and everybody's just going to work these things out of the ballot box?
I would say there's still some concerns about it, but I think the tension from the summer has died down quite a bit. And it's clear that concerns about that played a big role, because what I call the anti-nationalist vote was very strong. An awful lot of voters went to the polls and mustered behind 3 separate parties, saying they really did not like this extreme nationalism. They wanted a government that was more tolerant and that treated all the citizens, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds, fairly, which, I think is sort of a vindication of democratic spirit and surprised a lot of observers.
Yeah. Well, I'm not the biggest fan of democracy. I'd rather have no state at all, but it sure is nice when people go, yeah, okay, so we lost this election, better luck next time, instead of just grabbing their rifles.
And that, in fact, that was the message that President Obama sent to President Otunbayeva, that, the election results were a surprise to everyone, and that pretty much shows that they really were fair.
Right. Okay, right on. All right, so now let's talk about the most important thing in the world, which is the biggest leak in the history of the world, and that is the Iraq war logs that WikiLeaks put out over the weekend, basically. And one of the most important stories from that, as told by The Guardian, for example, in their article, Iraq War Logs Secret Order That Let U.S. Ignore Abuse, is about something called Fragmentary Order, or Frago, 242. And apparently, Scott, what this order said was if the AKA, whatever you call it, Badr Brigade / Iraqi army is torturing people, you don't have to do anything about it.
Yeah, that's right. We can well understand why the U.S. would have kept this order and its conduct in applying it secret, because, of course, this order was illegal. The U.S. had a very, very clear obligation under international law, to intervene and to stop torture. It also had an obligation, if it knew that the government was engaging in torture, not to turn prisoners over. And they basically disobeyed that. And we had a couple of reported incidents back during the war in which officers, in one case a general, in one case a troop of guardsmen from Oregon, observed the Iraqi police or Iraqi military actively engaged in torturing people, and they intervened and stopped them. We were hearing from back channels after these incidents occurred that, it seems like people, actually not so much the Baghdad command, but political figures in Washington really didn't like this. And it seems that, there was a decision made in the Pentagon or in Washington, maybe even in the White House, to stop this process of intervening to block torture. And I think the attitude seems to be, well, torture is a legitimate practice of governments, and, if the Kyrgyz government if the Iraqi government wants to go out and torture people, that may not be great, but, it's their prerogative to torture. We're not going to stop them from doing it. After all, we do it too. This Convention Against Torture, who cares about that? I'm putting a little bit of sarcastic twist on it, but not that much. But I think the real major objection that they articulated went like this. Our drawdown in Iraq assumes that we're going to be turning over all these prisoners to the Iraqi government. And, all these international law requirements would block us from doing that. So the solution is we just ignore those international law requirements, and we turn people over to a government that will torture them anyway. So that was the decision of the Rumsfeld Pentagon, and it was carried forward by Gates.
Yeah. Now, I was kind of clumsy in the way I explained it, but I think it is kind of important to note that the Iraqi army, especially at the beginning, when Donald Rumsfeld was still, well, he was there through 2006, but in the beginning of the war, the Iraqi army was basically the Badr Brigade of the Supreme Islamic Council, partly the Mahdi army of Muqtada al-Sadr, and they had what was announced at the time by the neocons, who didn't know they were supposed to be embarrassed or keep this a secret or whatever, was that we're going to use the El Salvador option. They put it in Newsweek. We're going to use the El Salvador option, where we're going to hire the leaders of the Shiite militias, who, after all, they're Iraqis, they're from here, and they know who to kill, and we're going to use them to do these decapitation strikes, and we're going to use them to take out the leadership of this Sunni insurgency and nip it in the bud, and this was clearly all from Rumsfeld down. And these were the people doing the torturing of those arrested that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In fact, that Newsweek story, I remember speaking with the people who wrote it the week it came out. They had some pretty amazing documents about the Salvador option. They also had a lot of evidence that, in fact, a colonel who had been involved in the implementation of the Salvador option was brought back in and sent off to Iraq to try and re-implement it, copying what had been done in Salvador in Iraq. So they were really quite literally trying to follow as a positive precedent what had been done in El Salvador. But I think we got to back it up a little bit here too and note that, remember, the Iraqi army was destroyed. I mean, this was the controversial original decision made against the advice of all the people on the ground in Baghdad, who said that you have to keep the army in place, you have to preserve them because it's the only way you're going to have order. Instead, a decision was made to stand down the army and basically disband it.
Yeah.
So there
All right, now hold it right
army.
there. I'm sorry, Scott. We were up against this hard break, but hold it right there. We'll be right back, everybody, with the other Scott Horton, heroic anti-torture human rights lawyer. Harpers.org/subjects/no comment. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's AntiwarRadio. I'm Scott Horton, Antiwar.com Scott Horton, out here in L.A. I'm on the phone with Harper's Scott Horton, the heroic international human rights lawyer over there on the East Coast. He just got back from Kyrgyzstan We're just helping monitor a democracy that no doubt in some measure was inspired by the teachings at the university, the American University in Bishkek, that he co-founded. So put that one in your pocket to keep, Scott. That's a good one. All right, but we're talking about the Iraq War and the giant WikiLeaks dump from over the weekend, approximately 400,000 documents leaked, and orders that torture be ignored. Now, when we went out to the break, Scott, we were talking about how the Pentagon disbanded the Iraqi army, and I don't know whether maybe it would have worked out the same anyway, but certainly once that was done, the Ayatollah Sistani said, we want one man, one vote, and if you don't give it to us, you're going to have to start this war all over again. And from that point on, the whole caucus system and the whole, Paul Bremer's going to set this thing up in a Lebanon-style confessional system or whatever. All that was thrown out. We're turning the country over to the Iranians, damn. And that was in, the spring of 2004.
Yeah, and instead of having a professional trained army, which had problems, but was still a professional trained army, suddenly we had a dozen different sectarian militias who had no, formal, proper training, and who battled using, terror tactics. And by the way, these are a lot of militia groups that we were supporting in the Army and giving guidance to. And then we decided to make them into the Army. So, of course, they were engaged in horrible abuse. We had advisors attached to many of these groups. We could monitor what they were going on constantly. And one of the things I think that emerges from WikiLeaks is that, the American soldiers on the ground were doing a very good, conscientious job of documenting exactly what they saw. And they were sending notes back to headquarters saying, hey, we're observing this. Shouldn't we do something about it? And the response that would come back would be, no, stand down, don't do anything. I think, frankly, the WikiLeaks documents speak well of the American soldiers on the ground. They speak horribly of the Pentagon.
Well, and, in case people aren't too familiar with this, maybe they, weren't paying attention to foreign policy back then, but now they are, or something like that. We're talking about absolute medieval worst forms of torture, drills through the shoulders and into the brain, and the worst kinds of electroshock, and the wax museum of torture. That's what was happening to the Sunni insurgents abducted by the Badr Corps and the Mahdi army.
About anything that is remotely borderline. This is like no one is going to. There were many, many documented cases of the use of the electrical drill. Actually being used to drill into people's skulls.
Yeah. And so when I first saw this Guardian story, the first thing I thought of, and I thought it was, I couldn't figure out whether it was Tommy Franks or Richard Myers, whatever. I'm Googling around trying to find it. Finally, I found it, and it was General Pace, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it was in the end of 2005. He did a joint news conference with Donald Rumsfeld, and the subject of detainee abuse under the so-called Iraqi army came up. And General Pace said, quote, "It is absolutely the responsibility of every U.S. service member, if they see inhumane treatment being conducted, to intervene to stop it." And Donald Rumsfeld basically interrupted him the way I remembered it and said, "Yeah, but I don't think you mean they have an obligation to physically stop it," he said. "It's just to report it." Pace stood his ground. I'm now reading from an article at 89.3 KPCC's website. Pace stood his ground, informed by the U.S.'s military's own guidelines. Quote, "If they are physically present when inhumane treatment is taking place, sir, they have an obligation to try to stop it." This is the general correcting Rumsfeld's attempted correction of him about what is the military law when it comes to things like this.
That's right. And what General Pace says is exactly correct. There's never been any ambiguity about what military doctrine and military law require. They require intervention to stop it if it's observed. And it's very, very clear here that Rumsfeld and his politicals, and we're talking mostly, the neocon